very blustery night. This is our last lecture before Christmas, so welcome. I'm afraid we haven't got Zoom tonight because of problems with technology, but it's being filmed, and everybody who signed up for the Zoom will get it tomorrow. So anyway, welcome to Leslie Downer. Leslie's been writing about Japan as a journalist, historian, novelist and non-fiction writing for as long as I've known her, which is nearly 50 years. She lived there for 15 years and often returns. Her writing covers cookery, geishas, travel and a quartet of novels. She's lectured to us many years ago, and I'm delighted to welcome you back, Leslie, to talk about her latest book, which of course we have for sale afterwards, The Shortest History of Japan. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you. The rest will not be in Japanese. So, hi everybody. It's very good to see you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Karen. We have indeed known each other for about 50 years. And I'm very happy to be back here again at the Highgate Literary and Scientific Institute. Oh, sorry, wrong way. So when I was asked to write The Shortest History of Japan, it seemed to me to be a wonderful way to bring together some 45 years of love of and interest in Japan and its history. It's like a kind of coda to a whole lifetime lived in and around Japan. And my first question, of course, was, where do I start? How far back do I go? And that was actually rather easy, because the Japanese, as you may or may not know, were the world's first potters. They made the world's first pot in about 14,500 BC. So 14,500 BC, imagine that you are all hunter-gatherers, and probably a woman picks up a little lump of clay soil and shapes it into a kind of cup shape. And then somehow this cup shape ends up in a bonfire, and you discover it's very hard. And that means that instead of just having to roast your meat over a spit, you can also boil food, you can simmer food, you can steam food, and you can cook foods that are inedible raw, like chestnuts, for example. So you suddenly have a much wider diet, your food is much softer, you don't have to chew it so much. That gives your brain a chance to grow a bit more. So it's the most extraordinary advance in technology, pottery. Way, way more game-changing than the internet is for us. And actually, these hunter-gatherers were very successful. And although they continued to be hunter-gatherers, they were able eventually to specialize. So some of them went hunter-gathering, others stayed home, and they specialized in making pots. And some 10,000 years down the line, around 3000 BC, they were making pots. They were making pots like this. These are big pots, but this big. Some are in the British Museum. They're all different. They can be wave design or flame design, and they all have this kind of rope design, which is why these people were called the Jomon, or the rope design people. So obviously I would start my story with the Jomon people of Japan. And equally obviously I wanted to finish as near to today as I possibly could. So that meant that I would have to cover 16,500 years of Japanese history in 50,000 words, which was my word count. It is the shortest history. I also wanted to include women's stories. So Japanese history is not all shoguns and samurai. Women also played a very important part. So today I'm going to tell you some of those women's stories. And I'm going to, initially anyway, ask 3 questions. 1, who was she? 2, how did she get where she was? And 3, how do we know about her? So the very first person to emerge out of the mists of time, the first actual name in Japanese history is Himiko. And Himiko was a queen. And she lived about 140 years after Boadicea or Boudica, And unlike Boudica, she was not a warrior, she was a shaman. And this was an incredibly important superpower to have, because it meant that she could intercede with the gods. She could make sure that the crops would be good, that there wouldn't be disasters like great storms or like fires or like earthquakes, which there often are in Japan. And so she was made the queen in about 190 AD, and she ruled for about 60 years. So how did she get to where she was? Well, at that time, Japan was made up of lots of warring kingdoms. We're looking at, what, about 200 AD, as I say. So over here also, we had, what, Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, what have you, all busy fighting each other. Over in Japan too, they were all kingdoms, all ruled by kings, in other words by men, and they were all fighting. So around 190 AD, 30 of these kings got together and decided to make a federation and bring an end to the fighting. And they agreed that the only way to stop the fighting would be if they got a woman to be their ruler. So they got Himiko. And she apparently was descended from a line of queens. So in other words, there had been queens in the past that we don't know about. So how do we know about her? Well, at the time, the Japanese didn't have writing. But the Chinese did. The Chinese were the mighty, enormous neighbour just across the water, the enormous neighbour of Japan. And once she'd been on the throne for about 50 years, she ruled in all for 60 years, and when she'd been on the throne for 50 years, Himiko sent a delegation to the Emperor of China with tribute, and she sent 10 slaves and several bolts of silk. And obviously the delegation spent months and months going by boat, going by ox cart, going overland, ended up in the great capital of China, which was called Chang'an, it's now Xi'an, and gave this tribute to the emperor, who accepted it, and he recognized Himiko as the Queen of Wa, which is what the Chinese called Japan. Well, he was curious about this little island nation, little island queendom, I guess, off the coast of his own great territory. So he sent his own delegation, his own fact-finding mission, back to Japan. And of course, they had reading and writing. So these guys arrived, this Chinese fact-finding mission, and they wrote a long record of what they found in the kingdom of Wa. And they said that the people lived in thatched houses, little villages, and they grew all sorts of crops. They grew rice and they grew millet, they had animals, and some were tattooed from head to foot. They were tattooed from head to foot to protect them against dangerous fish, because they did a lot of diving for fish. And they said that Himiko herself lived in seclusion, so she wasn't seen by her people. She was protected by great watchtowers and by a great army, and by 1,000 women attendants who served her, and there was one man who was her spokesperson. They also reported that the people of the land of Wa grew mulberry leaves, which they fed to silkworms, and that they made beautiful silk. So we know that we can imagine that probably Himiko looked something like this, because they also made terracotta figurines dressed in the fashion of the day. So Himiko could well have been dressed like this, and archaeologists have found the jewellery, necklaces and coronets that a queen may well have worn. So she ruled in all for 60 years, and when she died, she was so valued, she was so awesome, that she was buried in a mammoth tumulus. This is like a massive island, and it's called Hashihaka. And it is said by the Chinese that she was buried with either 100 or 1,000 living attendants. But archaeologists say, no, the Japanese did not practice human sacrifice, so maybe she was buried rather with terracotta figurines like these. And after she died, the people got a king back to rule them, and the fighting started straight away. So they chopped him out, and they got Himiko's niece, who was also a shaman. She was 13, and she was called Iyo, and peace was restored. So Himiko had kept the peace for 60 years, so she was a very important figure in Japanese history. And as I said, the very first person in the whole of Japanese history, the very first named person. So we hear a lot about, I think, about whether a woman can inherit the imperial throne of Japan. And as you possibly know, the emperor has a daughter who's now 24, 25, and she may not inherit the throne, because according to the modern day constitution, only a man can inherit the throne. And in fact, the emperor's younger brother's son has now been recognised as the crown prince. But in the past, there were lots of empresses. In fact, there were 8 who ruled not that long after Himiko's time. And I'm going to tell you about 3 of the most interesting. So we'll start with Empress Suiko. And she came to the throne in 593, so we're way back in time. And she ruled for 35 years. And she was the daughter of the emperor, under whose rule Buddhism came from China. So in her time, there was a lot of development of Buddhist temples and also a lot of taking on of Chinese culture. It was a bit like after 1066 in England, when everybody wanted French culture. That was the sort of sophisticated culture. So in those days, Chinese culture was the culture of the time. And because she ruled for such a long time, there are quite a lot of pictures of her, Empress Suiko. And the other thing to know about her is that from way back when, basically you had the emperor who didn't necessarily have much actual power, and there was usually a clan or a family who would marry their daughters to the imperial family and who did wield the power. And in the case of this empress, she was the daughter of the Soka family, who were the ones who really had the power. So nothing terribly exciting happened in her reign, but after a couple of emperors, she was succeeded by Empress Kōgyoku. And Empress Kōgyoku came to the throne in 642, and she built a beautiful palace, because the previous palace would have been polluted by the death of the previous emperor. And so each emperor actually built a new palace. And at the time, the Soka family really held the power, and she did it. But she had a son, and he was called Prince Naka. And he was pretty fed up with not having any power. So he got together with a man called Nakatomi no Kamatai. And they met in a wisteria grove, and they made out that they were studying Chinese texts, but actually they were plotting. And there was a huge gathering in that marvellous imperial palace that she had built. And Prince Naka ordered all the gates to be closed. Everybody was going to be there, and he smuggled in a sword. And when everyone was gathered and the gates were closed, he lopped off the head of the young Soka chieftain. And that was the end of Soka power, like that. And Empress Kōgyoku had to abdicate immediately, because she'd been polluted by being in the presence of death. So you get some idea of the kind of thinking that was going on in this period. So Prince Naka did not take over, but he did wield the power. Her brother took over. Then she came back to the throne with a new name, because her previous name had been polluted. So then she became Empress Saimei. That's why she has 2 names. And then finally, she was about to lead an armada against the Koreans and Chinese who were threatening to invade Japan. And then she died of old age. And Prince Naka finally did take power. And under his reign, he ruled under the name of Empress Tenji. And this was a time of great interest in Buddhism, a lot of Buddhist culture, and a lot of Chinese culture. So that the ladies of the court dressed like courtiers in glorious Tang Dynasty China, and would have fitted in there very well. So it was a great flowering of culture under Empress Tenji. Now, our last empress is Empress Koken, and she was the daughter of the emperor who built the great Buddha in Nara, if you've been to Nara and seen the great Buddha. And she came to the throne. He managed to bankrupt the country by building the great Buddha. She came to the throne, and she was in rather poor health. And a very low-ranking Buddhist monk, whose name was Dokyo, had apparently magical powers. He'd been practicing meditation and austerities. He developed his magical powers, and he cured her. He was also rather young and rather handsome, and she took him to her bed, and she gave him lots of power. Now, there was a family. I told you that Prince Naka was conspiring in a wisteria grove. His co-conspirator was given the new name of Fujiwara, which means wisteria grove. And the Fujiwara family were now the people, the clan, the family that wielded the power. And the Fujiwara clan didn't like it at all that this low-ranking young monk was throwing his weight around and issuing orders and behaving as if he was the Prime Minister. So some of them rose up in rebellion, and Empress Koken sent an army against them, which defeated them and took the head of the Fujiwara leader. And so she had 1 million sutras, which are prayers, printed and put into 1 million little stupas, which are like this. They're quite little, and they are also in the British Museum, so you can see them. And to thank the Buddha for having given her victory. And this was the first instance of printing in the entire world, long, long, long before the Gutenberg press. Well, then Dorkio carried on running the show. He became Chancellor, he became priestly emperor. He even thought he might make himself emperor, but obviously Empress Koken held off against that. But eventually she died, and the Fujiwara very swiftly moved in. They could not execute him because you don't want to be haunted by a priest. That's a terrible thing to happen. But they did exile him. And they also decreed that women could no longer inherit the imperial throne because they were too easily influenced. So that was the end of women as empresses. There were a couple more, but that was really the end of the line of empresses. But that didn't mean that women weren't able to transform life in different ways. And in fact, there were many Japanese women who did change life in various other ways. So we're going to wind the clock on to 1000 AD, to Murasaki Shikibu. And over here, it's before 1066, right? It's 1000. So we're still fighting away, we're probably chopping each other up with axes, we're wearing helmets with horns on, we're quaffing mead, we're divided up into small kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, all those others, and we are probably illiterate. Now, in Japan, an absolutely marvellous civilization grew up in the city of Heian, which we know as Kyoto. And it was actually laid out on a grid plan, as Kyoto is to this day. And there were very glorious temples along these broad boulevards. This is actually an actual picture of Heian Shrine, which is an exact copy of the Heian Palace, which was the palace of the emperor in the city of Heian. So people travelled up and down the boulevards of the city of Heian in ox-drawn carts. And one of the peculiarities of the age was that women kept themselves hidden from the sight of men. But they did make sure, when I say women, I mean noble women. So this was a culture of noble men and noble women. Ordinary people didn't even count as people, actually. But this was the noble men and noble women who lived in these magnificent palaces. So the women travelled around in these ox carts, and they made sure that there was always a beautiful brocade sleeve dangling from the window so that people would know that inside this carriage there was somebody very beautiful. Well, that's a little anachronistic, but we do know what they would have looked like, because this is a modern day reenactment, and these ladies are dressed as they would have done in the Heian period. So it was a very aesthetic time. It was a time when the way that you colour coordinated your kimonos was really important. Whether you were moral or immoral was irrelevant, but you colour coordinated your 12 kimonos at the neck and at the wrist and at the hem. And they would paint their faces white, and their hair was long and glossy and black like a waterfall, trailed right down to the ground. And the only thing that's not quite right with this reenactment is that actually the ladies would have shaved off their eyebrows, and they would have painted in what they called moth's wings eyebrows up on their foreheads. So when a nobleman came to see a noble lady, she would receive him from behind screens. so that he could not see her face. And there are many very sad stories written by these ladies of how you might hear somebody's voice, you might fall in love with him from the sound of his voice, you might never ever get to, actually even to meet him a second time, let alone see him. So the men would come and they would visit the ladies who would be hidden behind screens. And if they had heard that a lady was particularly beautiful, the man might write a poem, and he might brush it in his best calligraphy on a piece of beautifully scented paper and send it in to her. And she would then study it. As I said, it was a very aesthetic age. She would study it. She would see if it was any good. If he sounded interesting, then she might write a poem back. They could knock out a poem just like that. They were very good at writing poems. She would send back her poem, and so they would go, sending poems back and forth. And if she really liked the sound of him, she would invite him to come in and visit. And he would come in at dead of night so that he wouldn't be able to see her face. And he would come in to her room, and they would be alone together, apart from about 40 or 50 servants who didn't count because they weren't people, they were just servants. And the servants would be very discreet, and they would know exactly who the man was because every man mixed his own perfume, and every perfume was different. And then, before daybreak, before cockcrow, the man would go, so he still couldn't see her face. So, this was an extremely literate society, where the men learnt Chinese characters, and they wrote rather stilted poems in Chinese characters. And the women, who were considered to be an inferior species, this is noble men, noble women. The noble women learnt only kana, which is a sort of alphabet. It's a syllabary. So they learnt this alphabet, and the idea was that they should be very pious, they should be able to read the sutras, so they could lead pious lives. But these were very sophisticated noble women, and they used this kana to write things like diaries, witty observations of all the ridiculous things they saw going on, descriptions of how it was living in this society, living behind screens, which is why we know so much about what this society was like. And one of these was the famous The Pillow Book of Seishomigan, very witty book. And another was the woman I mentioned to you who wrote about hearing a man's voice. He was outside on the veranda, so he couldn't see her face, and she couldn't see his, and she yearned for him, actually, for the rest of her life. So it's quite kind of touching. But the most famous of all these was called Murasaki Shikibu, and it wasn't even her real name. We don't know her real name. She was a lady-in-waiting of the second empress. There were two empresses, and she wrote a novel called The Tale of Genji, which is all about the tale of the golden, the shining Prince Genji, who's the absolute paragon of men. He's handsome, he's witty, he's a great dancer, he writes marvellous poetry, he's also kind-hearted. One of his weaknesses is that he falls in love all the time. And another is that he has tragedies in his life. So this is very different from the Epic of Beowulf that we were all listening to over here. This is about feelings, it's about relationships. So it's more like Proust, it's more like Jane Austen, and it's famous as the world's first novel. And it is completely fantastic. If you want to read a really gripping story, you should read the translation by somebody called Arthur Waley. It's a marvellous book. So this is written in 1000 AD before the Battle of Hastings, and it's the world's first novel. So, obviously, a society like this, an effete, decadent society like this, where everybody spends all their time writing poetry and mixing perfume, could not last forever. However, it did last for 400 years, which is a long time. 100 years ago from now is 400 years ago from now is 1625. So it's before, I think King Charles I still had his head, as far as I know. So, 400 years is a very long time. This society did last for 400 years, but towards the end of it, it was falling down. And these people were so busy writing poetry and mixing perfumes that they'd forgotten how to issue coinage, and they'd forgotten how to collect taxes, and they ended up hiding in their palaces because they were so afraid, because there were so many bandits around. And monks came down from the mountains and fought each other on the streets of this beautiful city. And eventually the samurai, whose job it was to police the place, charged in and grabbed power themselves. And so began the age of warriors, which went on for quite a long time. And among these warriors there were also women, of whom the most famous was a woman called Tomoe Gozen. So she lived a little bit before Richard the Lionheart. So it's an age of warfare over here as well. So it's around, where are we? Around 1180, Tomoe lived. And she was very beautiful. She had long black hair, she had white skin, but that wasn't quite the point. She was a great warrior and a great horsewoman. And she was the lover of a man called Kisono Yoshinaka. Now, the first shogun had emerged. The shoguns, these were guys who were trying to unite these many, many kingdoms, or many, many domains that made up Japan. And this was a kind of ongoing struggle to try and unite Japan. And the very first shogun was a man called Minamoto no Yoritomo, and his cousin was her lover. So she was high in the ranks, and the reason we know about her is because she is described in a very famous epic poem from this era, which is called The Tale of the Heike. Whenever a battle was imminent, Yoshinaka, that's her lover, sent her out as his first captain, equipped with strong armour, an oversized sword and a mighty bow, and she performed more deeds of valour than any of his other warriors. So she was a fabulous horsewoman, she could tame wild horses, she could gallop down cliffs, she could fight with all sorts of weapons, and she'd actually led a force of just 300 who drove the enemy, which was a force 2,000 strong, out of the city of Kyoto and fleeing to the western provinces. So she was their captain. But her weapon of choice was not the sword, not the bow, but the naginata, which is a long-handled sword. And there's a sort of a picture of it here. The naginata, the long sword, it was like a samurai sword, which is razor sharp, at the end of a long, long pole. The total length is 9 feet, so it's 3 meters long. And this continued through history to be the woman's weapon. And you can actually learn it in Dalston. I went to a class in this in Dalston. But if you were, all samurai women learnt to use I'll call it the naginata, okay? They learnt to use the naginata. Now the thing is, if you have an enemy samurai man and he's charging towards you and he has a samurai sword, his samurai sword is probably about, 1.5 meters long? Your long-handled sword is 3 meters long. So if you are nifty, you could actually slice his legs off while he's running towards you. You're very nifty. So this was her sword, her weapon. And unfortunately, her lover, again, got a bit too big for his boots. He decided he would take over from his cousin and become shogun himself. And obviously the shogun was not having any of this. He sent a massive army, including the most famous warrior, actually, of all time, who was called Yoshitsune, down to deal with this upstart cousin of his. And it was a huge battle in 1184, the Battle of Owazu, and in the end, Tomoe and her lover, they had only 5 of their followers were left alive. The rest had been killed. And so the lover called Tomoe to his side and he said, look, can you please just flee, go to the eastern provinces, make sure my story is not forgotten. Well, she's a great warrior, for heaven's sake. No way was she going to flee. So she looked around for a suitable opponent to show him what a glorious death she could die. And she saw a man called Honda no Morishige, who was the chieftain of the Musashi clan. And she grabbed him off his horse, poor man, held his head up against her saddle, and cut it off. And then she held out his head. This is why samurai used to have a topknot, so you could hold out the head. She held out his head to give to her lover. But when she looked around, his horse had become stuck in a paddy field, and he'd been shot and he was dead. So then she did actually strip off her armour and looked like an ordinary woman, fled to the eastern provinces, and so his story was not forgotten. So the next lady we're going to come to, we're moving on again in time, and we come to the time of Elizabeth I. And the very sad thing is that we don't have any pictures of Nene when she was young. Dono means lady, so it's Lady Nene. So you'll have to use your imagination. But she wielded power in a more traditional way for women, which was from behind the throne. So she was the daughter of a low-ranking samurai family, and they obviously wanted to marry her off. She was very beautiful, she was wise beyond her years, she was very, very brilliant. When she was 13, they decided they would marry her to a high-ranking samurai, and there were lots of handsome, high-ranking samurai who were very keen to marry her. But there was another guy he was a farmer's son. He was beyond, just unthinkably low-ranking. And he was very short, very scrawny, very, very ugly. His name was Tokichiro, but people called him Monkey because he was so ugly. And Monkey was in hot pursuit of Nene. Now, although he was ugly, he definitely had something going for him. He could make people laugh, he had an incredible charm, he could twist people around his little finger. And the great warlord of that day, whose name was Oda Nobunaga, had already spotted him. And although he was a farmer's son, Oda Nobunaga had made him his sandal bearer, which is quite an intimate job. And anyway, Nene went for him and they got married, despite her parents' objections. And he rose through the ranks with unbelievable speed. He became from sandal bearer, he went to gardener, he went to shield bearer, and then Oda Nobunaga decided to try him out on the battlefield. He was a very good warrior. Then he decided to try him out on strategy. He was a genius at strategy. It was said that Oda Nobunaga, this great warlord, was incredibly frightening. Everybody was very scared of him. But when he heard Monkey's voice, he tried his hardest not to let a smile creep across his face, but he just couldn't resist. So Monkey, or Tokichiro, had this incredible kind of power of personality. And after not very long of brilliant strategy, he was made a general. And he had this very famous helmet. He also got a new name, which is Hideyoshi. He's gone into now in history as Hideyoshi. And Nene had obviously made a very good choice in marrying him. And then he went on yet higher, and he became a warlord in his own right. And he was given his first castle, which is in Shiga Prefecture. Now, he was away on campaign nearly all the time, because they were battling to unify Japan, which was made up of many warring domains. And Oda Nobunaga had to conquer one domain and the next domain, so there was fighting going on all the time. And Nene's husband was out there fighting, and the reason we know about her is because they exchanged letters, loads and loads of letters. We don't have her letters, but we have his. And he asked her about things like strategy. He told her about, how many heads he'd taken on the battlefield, how many hostages, what would be a good thing to do next. And they also discussed things like how much taxation should we charge. So while he was out, she was running the castle. She was like a daimyo herself. Now, the problem with all this was, he was incredibly fond of her. He also wrote to her once. He wrote, my skin is getting a bit suntanned, my hair's getting a bit grey, I'm a bit worried that you might not fancy me when you next see me. He wrote that, very sweet. But the trouble was, like all men of his time, the more powerful you were, the more concubines you had. And he went a bit over the top. He had about 100 concubines. And the warlord, Oda Nobunaga, wrote to Nene. I'd like you to try and imagine the three people, Nene and Hideyoshi and Oda Nobunaga. He wrote, "Your beauty grows day by day. Tokichiro," that's her husband, "complains about you constantly, and it is outrageous. While that bald rat flusters around, trying to find another good woman, you remain lofty and elegant." So we can see her, lofty and elegant. Do not be jealous. Show Hideyoshi, that's her husband again, this letter. And actually what happened next was that Oda Nobunaga, who was the great warlord, was assassinated not long after. And by then, Hideyoshi was his second in command, he was his right-hand man. He took over, and he was made Kanpaku, which was like chief counsellor. It was like lord of the realm underneath the emperor. So basically, he was the wielder of power. And Nene, as his wife, was like the queen. So she'd risen from being a low-ranking samurai to being basically queen of the realm. So again, everything was lovely except for another fly in the ointment. And this was a lady called Lady Yodo. And while Nene was a modest, humble person, Lady Yodo was a prima donna. And she was incredibly beautiful, though this is not a great picture. She was a daughter of Oda Nobunaga's sister, so she was Oda Nobunaga's niece, so she was very high-ranking. And Hideyoshi was very fond of her. Of course, he still loved Nene, who was his wife. Now that Oda Nobunaga was dead, he was finishing off the unification of Japan, and he laid siege to Odawara Castle. There were like 2 clans left to subdue, and this was one of them. And he knew this was going to be a very long siege, and while the people were starving in the castle, he wanted his people, his men, to be entertained while they were outside. So he called in jesters and jugglers and dancers and musicians and prostitutes, and also told his generals to bring their wives and their concubines. Now, he had a problem because he wanted to bring Yodo, but he didn't want to upset Nene. So he thought about this, and he wrote to Nene like this. We have got the enemy like birds in a cage. I wish to send for Yodo. I wish you to tell her and make arrangements for her journey, and tell her that next to you, she is the one that pleases me most. Your skill is the best in this world, and our wish is always the same. So he's doing his damnedest to keep her on side. Well, he succeeded, of course, in taking the castle and in completing the unification of Japan. And Lady Yodo, as I said, this is a terrible picture, which is rather sad, but she succeeded in doing something that nobody had succeeded. There were 100 concubines, none of them had children. Nene couldn't have children, though they had some adopted children. And Hideyoshi desperately wanted an heir, and he was in his 50s. Lady Yodo had a son. There was no DNA testing in those days, but Hideyoshi was sure it was his son. And then this little boy who was called Tsurumatsu died, and Hideyoshi was distraught. And then she had another son who was called Hideyori, and he lived. And it was Nene's job as the wife to rear the children. So now we have peace in Japan, and this is a golden age. This is the age when the first really glorious castles were being built. Peasants were coming in from the countryside and becoming artisans and merchants. So it's sort of the beginning of modern Japan. And it was a time of unbelievable wealth, where people were wearing very beautiful garments woven with gold and silver. And Hideyoshi and Nene lived in the Jurakute, which is in Kyoto. Unfortunately not there anymore, long since disappeared. But it was a wonderful golden palace where they had parties, where Nene passed around trays of gold bars as gifts for the guests. And he also had a 10-day tea ceremony. Being a farming stock, he was very keen on culture. So he learned no dancing, and he particularly loved tea ceremony. So he organised a 10-day tea ceremony in Kyoto, and he invited everybody in Kyoto, everybody, from the peasants on. You had to bring your own mat and your own bowl. And so he there showed off his pure gold tea ceremony hut and his pure gold tea ceremony utensils. Well, the party only lasted one day because he got bored, so he stopped it. But he then, 10 years later, had a cherry blossom viewing party, which is reenacted to this day, and was also extremely spectacular. And there the ladies in their marvellous garments paraded through the streets. And then, eventually, he died. And then, now finally, we get to see Nene, because she became a nun, which is what you did if you were a samurai wife. It didn't mean you went into a nunnery, it just meant you cut your hair short and you dressed as a nun. But we finally get this picture of Nene in old age. So she managed to have a marvellous life. She managed to rise from really the bottom to the top of society. But there were a lot of women at this period who'd been displaced by all these years of warfare, and quite a few of them actually were completely destitute and had no choice but to become prostitutes or courtesans. So there were a lot of prostitutes and courtesans roaming the streets and roaming the countryside all over the country. And we're going to hear about one of them. We're going to wind the clock forward to 1603, which is a couple of years after James I came to the throne, and a couple of years before the gunpowder plot. And her name was Izumono Okuni. She built a stage in the dry riverbed of the River Kamo in Kyoto, and she started to do wild and outrageous dances. And the most outrageous of the whole lot was when she wore two swords like a man and did comic sketches. And people came along to see these comic sketches, and quite a lot of men queued up backstage to enjoy her sexual favours. And there was a bit of fighting going on, fighting over her sexual favours, and she did extremely good business. And soon all the courtesans and prostitutes of Kyoto were also doing wild and outrageous dancing and also doing very good business. And a word had to be found for this new art form, and that word was kabuki, which came from katamuku, which means to do something kind of off-beam. And the shogun had no problem with sexual morality. The shogun was now ruling, but they did have a problem with disorder. And so they banned women from the public stage. They said women could only perform in private. And then beautiful young men took over, the same problem arose, the samurai were fighting over the beautiful young men, and they too were banned. And so in the end, public performance could only be done by men, as it is to this day in the Kabuki theatre. This is a very, very famous male performer of female roles. It's quite old now, but this is quite an old picture. So all these women roaming around, how to make it orderly, how to instill order. And the answer was to put them into small towns well away from the city centre where they wouldn't pollute ordinary people's lives. So the first government licensed pleasure quarter, which was a kind of city of prostitutes and courtesans, was established in 1589 under Hideyoshi. But the most famous of these pleasure quarters was the Yoshiwara, which was outside the city of Edo, which was the shogun's capital, which we now know as Tokyo. And this was called the city of the nightless city, because there was no night. It was lit up day in all through the night. It was pleasure the whole time. And anybody could go there. Women could also go there. And this was painted by Hokusai's daughter. Hokusai is a very famous painter, but this is his daughter, whose name was Katsushika Oi, and she obviously is not critical of what she sees. She sees it as a beautiful, colourful scene. So if you were a poor man and you went to the Yoshiwara, you could walk around, you could see these ladies sitting behind lattices, you could perhaps, if you had a little bit of money, enjoy an hour or two with them. You could also definitely see the great courtesans walking down the streets on their high clogs, this is the bow of their obi, which is the sash that they wrap their kimono with, tied not at the back, as is usual, but at the front. And the suggestion was that if you were a very lucky guy, and very rich, and very patient, you perhaps might get to untie that obi. And these were spectacular processions, so much so that they continue to this day. Now, if you were a rich man, it was a very different matter. You would have already booked the courtesan, you'd be waiting in her boudoir, you might have to wait a really long time while she progressed down the road. But eventually, and while you were waiting, you'd have to show that you were worth her while by being a really big spender. So you'd have to call in all sorts of entertainers, which would all cost a fortune, pay for their food that would also cost a fortune, and eventually she would turn up. And then she might well play music for you. She might do tea ceremony for you. She would almost certainly dance for you. As to whether she would do any more than that, well, value added. If she were to just go to bed with everybody, she wouldn't be worth much at all. So it was, some of these women never went to bed with anybody, but the men were all hoping and hoping. And so it was a lot more to do with showbiz than it was to do with sex. And there were actually salons in the Yoshiwara where poets and artists came, and these ladies were like the queens of the salons. They presided over the salons. So they were a bit like rock stars or models or movie stars today. They were celebrities. And the whole culture of this society came out of the pleasure quarters. So the woodblock prints that you see and the kabuki theatre, all the culture of that era came not from the respectable side of society, but from the pleasure quarters. So 150 years went by, which again is quite a long time, and eventually some of these women realised that they didn't have to sell their bodies to make a living. They were really into their arts, and they were professionals, and they called themselves arts people, geisha. So if we see the courtesan again, with her great big obi knotted at the front, suggesting you could open it up if you want to, and her huge headdress, very heavy, and her thick robes, the geisha were completely different. They did not steal the courtesan's customers, and they tied their obis modestly at the back, and they were really into their professions. And eventually, as time went on, it became much more cool for a young man about town to be seen with a geisha on his arm than with an overdressed, over-made-up courtesan. So, we're getting low on time. But if I may just zip through, Commodore Matthew Perry, who was an American commodore with 4 ships, turned up in 1853 and just brought the whole thing to an end. And in the end, the shogun was overthrown. Emperor Meiji came down from Kyoto, where he lived, to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, which means Eastern Capital. But there was still resistance against the new government. So there were people fighting on behalf of the shogun, and among these people were women. And the most famous was Nakano-Takeko. And there was a huge siege of Aiza Castle. Now, you've probably never heard of Aiza. Aiza is right next door to Fukushima. You've heard of Fukushima. You've not heard of Aiza, and the reason why is because these guys were on the wrong side of history. And their castle eventually was taken and destroyed. But before that happened, at one point the castle gates opened and a whole brigade came charging out, holding only the long-handled sword, which is the weapon of women. And their leader was Nakano-Takeko, who was 21, this is her. And they, for a moment, the army shouted up to hold fire, because these were women. And women charged in with their long-handled swords and set about these men, chopping them up. But then the army quickly shot them. They shot her, and her sister cut off her head so it wouldn't be taken as a trophy. And so we have the Meiji Restoration, which was the Victorian age in Japan, when there was a constitution written which said that women should be good wives and wise mothers, which was a pretty terrible thing. They'd been rather free before that. But eventually we come to the Jazz Age, and everything changed again. And now we have women who were flappers, and women who could make a living. They could be typists, they could be nurses, they could be clerks, they could be elevator girls, and they smoked, they could dance, they could talk about Marxism. It was a couple of decades of incredible freedom before World War II. It was called the age of speed, sex, and sport. And they also wore short skirts, and they cut their hair short, which was even more revolutionary. And among them, there were militant feminists, such as Hiratsuka Raicho, who said that marriage was slavery during the daytime and prostitution at night, and went off with a married man, and then got rid of him. That didn't work out. Went off with a much younger man, had 2 children, didn't get married until her children were grown up. and published a magazine called Blue Stocking. This is her magazine, full of extremely steamy stories written by women until the government put paid to it and had stopped it being distributed. And her most famous contributor was a poetess called Yosano Akiko, and she also went off with a married man. She had 11 children by this married man, and she was a poet. She wrote a book of poems called Medare Gami, which means tangled hair, which was steamy poems about how she felt about this man. And so these women took their lives into their own hands. Their power was their independence. And the first issue of Blue Stocking begins with these words: "In the beginning, woman was the sun." And this is a reference to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, the creator of all life. So she, to this day, is as powerful as ever, because she's now a major figure in manga and in anime. So I talk about all this, and an awful lot more as well, in 50,000 words, in the shortest history of Japan. There are some copies on sale, and if you were interested in buying one, I could sign it with my special signing pen, and stamp it with the gold crest of the Tokugawa Shoguns. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for that very entertaining talk. I'm sure that, as you say, you've just talked about one strand of the book, so it would be amazing to be able to take one home and read it. But we've got some time for questions. Let's start here.
Was there any kind of legal system? Was it very repressive?
Can you say that again?
Any kind of legal system for ordinary people to get justice or anything like that?
Legal system about what?
Having a law.
Injustice.
Yeah, of course there was a legal. Yes, of course, there was a huge legal system covering. And I mean, about a particular topic or just generally. Yes, of course there was a legal system. There were judges. There were prisons. There were crimes. Yeah.
The kind of like theft and murder and that kind of thing.
Theft, murder. I see. So theft, murder. In the countryside, cutting down trees actually. And there were, I'm trying to think what other, lots of crimes. Also, after the beginning of the Shogun period, which was 1603, there was a very sharp division between samurai who wore two swords and peasants.
They have life and death power over the others.
What?
Didn't they have life and death power over the others?
The samurai?
I'm sorry. Didn't they have life and death power over the lower echelons?
Yeah. The samurai, apparently, in theory, had the right to test their swords on a peasant's neck. But if you did, there was a massive amount of paperwork. And most of them thought it wasn't worth the paperwork. So they didn't bother. So most of them would test their sword on a corpse, which was perfectly okay. But as I said, cutting down trees. But another thing that was illegal was the lower ranks having weapons. I think they might have been allowed something like blunderbusses, but guns were not really developed from 1603 onwards. So the lower ranks were not allowed to have weapons. And there was actually a sword collection when the swords were taken in before that period began. And I think also if a man wanted to get divorced from his wife, he could do so. It was called the 3-line divorce. You just wrote, I divorced this woman. On the other hand, if you were a woman and you wanted to escape from your husband, you could, if there was a certain temple which was a divorce temple, and if you ran like the wind, and you ran and he didn't catch you and he didn't catch you, you got to outside this temple. If you could just throw your shoes over the wall, that counted as being in the temple, and you were then divorced. And I think the other thing was if a woman committed adultery, the husband was obliged to kill her. But a lot of husbands didn't actually want to because they rather liked their husbands, but they were legally supposed to kill their wife if she committed adultery. So there were laws of that sort. This is just random ones that come to my mind. I mean, I'm sure there's much more serious things too.
Thank you, those are fascinating stories. What about Japanese women today?
Well, as we know, we have a Prime Minister now who is, on the one hand, she's a woman, and on the other hand, she's very right-wing. So I think the Japanese are well aware of how the West thinks things ought to be. So they are doing their best to, get more women into high positions in business, if there are women that want to do that. So in theory, there should be more opportunities to women than there have been in the past. There was a Prime Minister called Abe, and he initiated something called Womenomics, which was supposed to be getting women into high positions and helping women to earn more. But obviously, it's a difficult thing to bring about this kind of social changes. But I mean, I remember meeting women in '78. I met some very liberated women, loads of liberated Japanese women who actually spent a lot of time smoking to show me how very liberated they were, which was a bit annoying. So I think maybe it's a bit like here, that sort of for these things to filter right down is quite difficult. But I think the Japanese are aware that's something that ought to be happening.
But you said they were worried about the falling birth rate.
One hears all about the falling birth rate, yeah, and also about the ageing population. I don't know what can be done about that. There's also an issue about marriage, that quite a lot of Japanese women don't particularly want to marry anybody, or particularly not to marry a Japanese husband, because there's still this kind of belief that means you're going to be stuck at home while the husband goes out to work. And so when I was there in about the early 90s, I remember I did an article about, there was a school for Japanese bachelors, and it was teaching young Japanese men how to talk to women because they found it so very difficult. So it's been something that people have been maybe aware of for quite a long time. But again, how you actually change things is as here too, it's difficult to make things change.
Okay, well, there's no more questions now, so can we thank Leslie again before we go on? And there is a glass of wine next door for everybody if they want one, and also books for sale and for signing. Thank you.